First Q&A session, Revelation edition. This is just kind of an opportunity we'll have over the next few weeks as we work our way on Sundays in the book of Revelation to try to tackle maybe some of the common questions or even questions that you submit about this book, because it just happens to be one of those places in Scripture that just stirs up the curiosity, but also a lot of confusion. And hopefully we can kind of work our way through some of that, and all of us can gain a little more clarity and understanding about this really important book. So we're going to tackle a couple questions today. The first one that came in asked this: why do you think so many Christians are looking and even hoping for the end times? Amos chapter 5 is very clear that it's not going to be good for anyone. And in verse 18 of chapter 5, it says this: woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not light. A really great question, because the theme of the day of the Lord that really runs its way throughout the whole of Scripture, all the way back in the book of Exodus at the beginning and continuing on. It's in some ways it sends some mixed signals, because the idea of the day of the Lord sounds like it should be something pretty great. Our hope should be vested in the coming of the day of the Lord, and in many ways that's right and correct. But it's hard sometimes to understand, because so often when we see the theme of the day of the Lord coming up in Scripture, it's not that dissimilar to what we read in Amos. Sounds like a day of judgment, a day of God's coming, that there's going to be destruction, and it just does not sound much like a day to look forward to. But one of the things that's really important for us to understand about what the day of the Lord is all about is it is about God putting the world right. It's about God restoring all of creation, bringing all things to their ultimate fulfillment and purpose, and back to that intended purpose for why they were first created. And one of the things that I think we all know is how much sin and death has marred the world. It has kind of broken things and turned things away from God and going in corrupt ways rather than in according to the ways that God has created things to be. And so when we understand this day of the Lord as this hope for God's ultimate and final coming, it is this hope that God is going to work in every circumstance and situation to bring things back to the way they're meant to be, which means that he's going to have to turn upside down the things that are seemingly right side up right now, and he's going to have to bring down all those things that are in places of power and authority and things that maintain the status quo. All of those things are going to have to be leveled and brought down, and the things that are lowly and marginalized and cast aside, those things are going to have to be brought back up again so that things can truly be restored in righteousness, in equity, in truth, the way that God has envisioned for things to be. And so this really, it digs into a lot of the violent imagery we see in the book of Revelation, and we see in a lot of other places in Scripture as well, that makes us wonder why God is acting so violently. But we have to understand, this isn't that God is violent in his heart, or that God is even intending to come to us with violence. But when things are wrong and they need to be made right, well, those things as they are right now, those things that are holding on to power and authority, they are going to be resistant to the coming of the ways of God that says we have to reorder, restructure, remake things to be as they're meant to be. They're going to be resistant and fighting against God's authority, because, like all of us, we want to be an authority. We want to determine what's right and wrong. That's the original sin we see with Adam and Eve, isn't it? That we want to determine right and wrong on our own terms. And so when God comes again, God is going to put all things right. And like Amos warns and so many other prophets and so many other places in Scripture, we, even as God's children, are not exempt from that world being made right. And so if we do not choose to submit our hearts and our lives to God, then the day of the Lord will be a scary day, even for us, because we are living in resistance to God's way and not choosing to submit to God's way in the here and the now. But ultimately, it is a day of hope, because it's the day of God's ultimate fulfillment, that things will be made right. Hopefully that makes some sense. Along with that question is asked kind of the question about the rapture, and is this where maybe some Christians hold on to some hope about the end times because of this idea of the rapture? And I think, yes, that might be a place where a lot of people hold on to hope, but it would be, in my mind, a hope misplaced. I don't think that rapture theology is biblical theology. And I'll give you 3 reasons why. And I know not everyone agrees on this, but I think biblical scholarship really fleshes this out in a lot of really important ways. Number one, I don't think that you can find any place in Scripture that really supports the idea of a rapture, this idea that at some point God's going to take all of his children out, and then the rest of the world is going to live through this really dark tribulation period. I don't see that in Scripture. The places that people often go to is in 1 Thessalonians 4, or in the Gospels, where Jesus talks about that a husband, and wife, one will be taken and one will be left. But if we really understand those texts in their original context, and unfortunately we can't get into all of it right now, but we begin to understand that those texts are not talking about God taking people out prematurely from the world, or rapturing them at all. The second thing I would say is, in the book of Revelation, the word rapture, the idea of rapture, it never comes up. And in fact, the overwhelming theme in the book of Revelation, and again, this is true in the whole of the Scripture, is this call to endurance. It's this call to overcome. We read is written to every church, all 7 of the churches, and again, this call to endure and to keep and remain faithful in the face of suffering, not to evade or escape suffering. And so if the idea of the rapture was a biblical idea, I don't know that we would have such a dominant theme of enduring in the book of Revelation. And the last thing I would say is that I don't think that the idea of the rapture can be biblical, because it's an escapist mentality. It is all about getting away from and being taken out of the earth, escaping the things that are going on here, and the corruption and the brokenness and the pain. And again, I just don't think that is God's heart or God's mind. I think what we see is that God died, sent his son to die for the world, that God's heart is the redemption of all things. In Revelation 22, we will eventually see that there's a new heaven and a new earth, which is not to say a destruction or a doing away with the old heaven, and the old earth, but a renewal, a remaking of all things in the final coming of God. And what we see is not everyone escaping and going to heaven, but heaven coming to earth. And behold, it says in chapter 22, verse 6, behold, I'm making all things new, not all new things. And so it's this idea that God is restoring, remaking, transforming the things that are, not destroying and doing away with them. And so I think that we play a vital role in God's work, just like we believe about the church today. Right now, we are participating in God's redemptive work, and I don't think that it ends, but instead we carry on that work and endure in that work until the hope of God's restoration of all things. Hopefully that answers some questions, and bring in some more. You can submit questions at the Welcome Center. You can text them to the church anyway. You want to write it on a slip of paper and get it to me. However you want to do that, and hopefully you'll join us again next week about this time. We'll drop another video. So God bless. Hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you on